Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you for braving the elements. You are indeed brave souls. But it's going to be worth it. We're going to have a great evening tonight. We're here to discuss Both Sides of the Sky, a really fantastic new collection of unreleased Jimi Hendrix material. And there's nobody better on earth to discuss and talk about this than the two gentlemen I have with us this evening. These two guys probably know as much or more about Jimi Hendrix than anybody in this on this green earth. We have with us the legendary engineer Eddie Kramer. Worked with Jimmy on almost every bit of recorded music we ever recorded, and along with him, John McDermott, who is a producer and in charge of the Hendrix catalog. So anyways, we're going to bring them both on now and have a great chat. Thank you.
You know, these are true fans to brave this weather.
Yeah. Woo! New Yorkers are tough.
Tough town. So, just for the audience here and the people that are watching out in Guitar World Land as a live stream, it would be great if you could just tell us sort of what your connection to the current Hendrix legacy is. John, I mean...
Well, Jimmy's father, Al Hendrix, waged a legal fight to reclaim the rights to his son's music and legacy. We assisted in that process because, as fans, we felt that it belonged there and with him. And as a result of that, he asked us to come in and help make sense of what had happened and where all the tapes were and the films and all of that. And then together with Jimi Hendrix, we've been involved since 1995.
1995. Seems like yesterday.
And Eddie, I think most people here know that you worked on, all of Jimmy's original recordings. But for example, what was your role in Both Sides of the Sky?
Basically, there's the power trio I like to talk about, which is myself, John McDermott, and Jimi Hendrix. We're the three guardians of the gate, and we do all of the work on Jimmy's music and anything to do with Jimmy. And for me, it's a privilege and it's an honor to keep making sure that the legacy that he's left behind, we continue to improve upon past stuff. And this album in particular was a joy, as all of them were, but this was an album that we had when we were doing People, Hell and Angels and the other previous albums, this is like the end of the trio. It's a trilogy, and this one felt different in the sense this was more of a studio type record where you can say he's jamming with his friends. You've got Stephen Stills, 2 tracks, and Johnny Winter. So for me, this was yet again diving into the vaults, figuring out what we're going to present, and it's a happy thing.
Great. So the album's called Both Sides of the Sky, and I was sort of curious, what is the significance of that title?
Well, we've often used things that Jimmy had written as inspiration for the titles. First Rays of the New Rising Sun was actually a title he was considering for the record he was making at the time of his death. But then other things that West Coast Seattle Boy was an unrecorded song, but we just felt perfectly suited him. Both Sides of the Sky was a lyric line in, it was kind of a hybrid of a song he was called Keep On Grooving, coupled with Midnight Lightning. I think it was just part of Jimmy's, creative evolution in his mind. It was going to fit somewhere. All of these songs have long tails, and that was one that sadly he just didn't live to finish. But we thought it suited the album very, very well. So we felt like, okay, we would use that.
Did you feel like it suited the record because, we hear both of Jimmy's rhythm sections on this record. I mean, did you, what in your mind, what are the two sides of the
Well,
sky?
partly that, but also too it was an opportunity to show Jimmy as a sideman within his own, serving his own songs, but inviting others to play with him, like Stephen Stills or Lonnie Youngblood or Johnny Winter. So I think, we just felt that, again, it was a typical Jimmyism, and we were able to, it's nothing articulates Hendrix better than Hendrix. So when you're able to draw on him, whether it's his song drafts or things that he left behind, these are things that I think help inform what we're trying to do. So it just struck us as a cool title for the project. The more we got deeper into the music, we're like, yeah, this is great. It's a good fit. Good fit.
So as Eddie mentioned, this is the third record of a trilogy of great sort of unreleased studio-oriented tracks. Do you see that each three of these records, did they have a particular theme in your mind, or is it just putting together a great record that flows?
No, I think, to answer the question, when we started with this whole process, it's important to understand that, when the Hendrix family took over the library in 1995, so many tapes were missing and all tied up in legal problems, and it required a lot of work for us. Eddie and I listened to everything that was in the library, and started to think about things that we wanted to set aside for different releases. But I think when we got to Valleys of Neptune, the idea was to, look at the remaining studio material and start to present it in a way which we felt would give fellow fans like you, a kind of a deeper appreciation and understanding of what he was doing post-Electric Ladyland. So with Valleys of Neptune, there were certainly more recordings with Mitch and Noel, the original band, as they were coming apart. And I think as we moved forward to People, Hell, and Angels, and now this record, you hear in the case of Banish Boy, it's the first ever Band of Gypsies session with Buddy Miles and Billy Cox. We also felt it was the opportunity for us to show both Jimmy's version, for example, of Hear My Train A-Coming, which we thought was brilliant on People, Hell, and Angels, but here was another great version with the original Experience right at their end. So each of the records gave us that opportunity to kind of share the music with you and fans throughout the world, but in a way where you could come away and say, wow, okay, this gives me a window into where Jimmy was at that particular time in his career, life and career.
When I was talking with people about this interview, one of the questions that came up was, how on earth do you decide, like, which tracks, ultimately get presented? Is it obvious to you, or is it a struggle?
No, it's no struggle for me.
It's a struggle to decide which tracks, which things to use.
Well, there's always a discussion, that's for sure. When presented with the material, you're sitting down in the studio, putting a tape on for the first time and listening to it and going, oh my God, that is just spectacular. We have to have this on the record. And another song will come up and go, yeah, that's good, but is it as good as that one? And so there's always this process of, we got a stack of stuff that we put aside, like mice putting little bits and pieces across the room like over there. And it was during the time of the previous album that we had actually discovered a bunch of stuff. And we always look at each other, this track should be put aside for what we got. We have an idea of what's coming down the pipe. So maybe the struggle is, John sometimes would say to me, hey, what do you think of this? Maybe not so good. We discuss it, kick it around. But we always came up with a decision, okay, this track has it.
I mean, when we first went through every tape in the library, and I think it was September of '95, I was making detailed notes, and the Isabella and the Hear My Train A-Coming that were on People, Hell, and Angels, it's funny, Eddie and I looked at each other and said, let's keep an eye on that. We're going to be coming back to that. So they reveal themselves. I mean, one of the things we've been able to do, which some of you may know, is we created a bootleg label where we can get deeper into the catalog, into the more formative things. They're not sold in stores. They're really aimed by fans, for fans. So I think we have avenues to share the music, but when you hear these three records, as they've now become a trilogy, they reveal themselves to be more, much more formed, and we have a clear sense of what Jimmy was trying to achieve.
So let's dive into some of these wonderful tracks. I've had the pleasure of listening to this record for over a good week, and it'll take the rest of my lifetime to really appreciate everything on it. But the very first track, it's this really sort of joyous, bouncy take on Muddy Waters' "Mannish Boy." Do you remember anything about the session, Eddie?
Not so much the session, because as we discovered, this whole series of songs, a lot of it was done in '69. Now, 1969 was a very different period for Jimmy. This was his period of change. He's trying to find his new direction. Plus, we're building Electric Lady Studios. I'm not available all the time to go and be on the sessions with him. I know I'd get the phone call like at midnight. Hey man, can you come over to the record plant or the Hit Factory? Come and help us, the things, it doesn't sound so good. Okay, all right, Jimmy, I'll be right there. I jump in the cab, go in the session and try to help him pull it all together. And, it starts to sound cool, he's happy. I get home at like 6 in the morning, whatever it is, and I'm on to the next thing. But this year of '69 was this year of change, and you can hear it in this Mannish Boy, because this is the new funky R&B bluesy kind of direction that he's headed in.
What sort of, did Jimmy place a lot of importance on traditional blues?
Yeah, it's his basic. That's
his
the
root music.
foundation.
No
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
And think of Billy and Buddy. They were all, that was common language between those guys. So, they all love Muddy Waters. Billy played with Freddie King, Gatemouth Brown. Slim Harpo. He's on some amazing records as a sideman after Jimmy had gone to England. So that for them it was joyous. Like, hey man. And I think it's great is that, Jimmy's kind of doing both the Bo Diddley and the Muddy Waters in the piece. So, I think if you go back to People, Hell and Angels, when we put their version of Bleeding Heart, it's funny because Jimmy tells the guys, look, let's do this with a different beat. Like, he loves the song, but just doesn't want to simply replicate it, but he wants to take it to a different place. And I think that's one of the interesting things when you ask about blues, is that, a lot of the English musicians were copying the blues because they were so inspired by it. Well, Jimmy could do that, but he was also writing original blues. Red House, Hear My Train Coming. He was trying to push the genre forward.
Well, I want to bring up something because you were singing the line that Jimmy actually was singing in unison with his playing on Mannish Boy, which is such a cool line. Okay, imagine Jimmy standing in the studio. This is one of the things that when I first put up the tapes and listened to it, the hair on the back of my head stood straight up. This is just joyous, as you said. A classic, fabulous Hendrix, but he's live, standing in the studio, martial ants screaming behind me, drums over there, right? And it's a wonderful live performance. He's playing lead guitar and rhythm guitar at the same time. Then he's nodding to the band like, here's where we go in here, we go in there. And then when he gets to the solo, it's in unison with what he's playing on the guitar. It's just a masterful performance.
It makes sense that they would start out with a Muddy Waters song, right? Because wasn't that sort of their shared language? You said it was from the first session.
That was the first Band of Gypsy session.
Yeah.
Billy had played the night before, and if folks know the Purple Box set that we put out in 2000, there's a recording in there where Jimmy and Billy Fox were at the Scene Club, and Jimmy wanted to record, so he brought a couple of guys from this group called the Cherry People, who just happened to meet and said, hey man, can you play drums? We need a drummer, come on over. So, and that, they cut a couple of different things with those guys. The next night Buddy Miles was there, and Buddy was somebody that, Jimmy had talked to Billy about, said, look, I got this cat, you're gonna really like him. And they loved Buddy because, he just had an infectious humor and vibe, and he was a character, and so I think after all the hard times that had gone on, particularly as Jimmy and Noel's relationship started to break apart, I think it was a breath of fresh air to have those guys. And also think about this, Brad, it is a music business. Jimi Hendrix could have picked anybody that might have boosted his profile, sold more records. He chose two guys that, he was comfortable with as friends. So
Yes.
you have to place a lot of importance on that decision as a result of that.
And also, what John was alluding to was Buddy Miles' sense of humor. I have this great picture of Buddy Miles in the record plant, sitting next to Jimmy, and he's making Jimmy crack up because he was a funny guy.
Yeah.
And Jimmy had a wicked sense of humor, but Jimmy was really shy. And this image of Buddy Miles sitting back in the chair like, yeah, and Jimmy is cracking, Jimmy was so shy, he would put his hand in front of his mouth and go, and he would laugh like this. Swear to God.
Do you, I mean, I don't know whether he ever shared this with you, but do you think that this was sort of a warm-up for these guys, or do you think it was ever intended to be released as a record track? It's got a pretty tricky arrangement to it. It seems like they put some thought into it.
I think the unique circumstances of Jimmy's life at that time, I mean, he was involved in a very contentious litigation with Ed Chalpin, who, when Jimmy was in Curtis Knight and the Squires, prior to his fame, he signed a one-page agreement thinking it was a release for those sessions. And unfortunately, it was a binding contract which he had to litigate his way out of. So, you know, that created the album Band of Gypsies, for which we're all grateful. But during the period of late 68 into 69 into 70, he was recording and recording and recording and just stacking all these things up. We can never say, what would Jimmy have done? That's not our job. Our thing is like, hey, we're going to share something with our fellow fans, Jimmy's fans, tell you when it was recorded, with whom, why it's, you know, contextually important to his legacy. Who knows? I mean, he could have, you know, he could have recut it. We don't know, but I mean, I think on that session there were 5 reels of multi-track tape. So he was trying to get something that night, no doubt.
Well, also another one of the standout tracks I think on the record is Lover Man. I mean, it's fantastic. This is a song that Jimmy played quite a bit in concert before he recorded this, and I mean, everything is going gangbusters on that. Everybody's playing super tight. Did he ever consider that as becoming a master? Do you think
Sure.
that song?
You know, Eddie recorded a version during the Our Experience sessions. We put a version with Mitch and Billy from 1970 on the Purple box set. I think what's interesting about this one is that if you listen to this, as well as the Hear My Train A-Coming from People, Hell and Angels, that's the same arrangement that they use for the Band of Gypsies concerts. So, you know, talk about hand and glove. I mean, those guys, like, once they had it, and they knew there wasn't a lot of talk. I think, you know, you could speak to that. Jimmy would just direct them and
Not only was there not a lot of talk, but the sequential events of how a song came about. It was very interesting. Jimmy would maybe write a song in late 68, try recording it in 69, different rhythm section, different people in the band, whatever, and then maybe 6 months even after that, come up with the final version. It took him a while to really sort of solidify what the arrangement was and who was actually going to come up with the best performance of it. So that's why there's so many of them around.
Well, this plays into the next song I want to talk about. Like, there's an incredible version of "Hear My Train A-Comin'" on this record, a great studio version. I'm sure you guys know a lot of the great live versions, and this was, you know, on par with, you know, Voodoo Child or Red House or you know, just one of those great slow blues songs. And it's a really good version. I mean, it's very ferocious. I'm trying to, I don't know whether he ever shared with you, Ed, like, well, this is obviously great. Why does this make it on a record? Or why, you know, why isn't it, like, why didn't this make it? Did he ever share with you of, like, why, like, a track just didn't hit him in the right way? Like,
I'm not so sure he would share that, or whether he would have just gone, He would more like a, or would just be a little, you know, we're going to work on something else. It was not often that he was that sort of verbal about it. It was during 1970 when after we built Electric Lady Studios, there was a 4-month period when we were working very closely together. He was so happy to be in his new home. I mean, it was his dream come true to be there. And so May, June, July, and August, 4 months, we were actually in Electric Lady. And Jimmy was on time, 7 o'clock every night, which was unheard of. I mean, he was always late. But the feeling that I was getting was that the process of all of the tapes that had been gathered up during 1969 were in the closet at Electric Lady. And we were just pulling piles of 16 tracks. I mean, just stack them up in the control room. And he would go, yeah, that one from that day. Okay, fine, let's just listen to that tonight. And we'd go through it, and then he would go, yeah, no, okay, let's move on to something else. You know, he'll find something that he knew he had worked on, and now he was going to give it a rebirth.
So, without getting too nerdy about all of this, I can't help myself, I'm sorry. Storing up all these questions for these guys.
How many hours you got?
Well, when I listened to, say, for instance, Cry Love, it felt to me that Jimmy was heading in a much more, like his studio work was becoming something much more structured. A lot more overdubs, sharper edges on the rhythms. I sort of wondered whether he would have thought something like Hear My Train A-Comin' was not fitting in with that was an older style for him.
I don't think so. I think that was a song he played live right up through 1970. I think you know, what's interesting about Electric Lady is that I think they were so excited by the quality difference of the studio. I think he was happy with, particularly where Billy and Mitch were at that particular time. So there were certain songs that had been cut at the record plant that they listened to. You know, Dolly Dagger, for example, there was a demo at the record plant. It didn't hold up anything to, you know, what they would do at Electric Lady. So he may have wanted and thought, okay, I'm going to want a blues on this record. But I really do think that he would have recut that particular song. It was an important song for him. And in a show where you still perform Red House, he would still do Hear My Train A-Comin'. So it was an important song. The original Experience did it, and then the 1970 version of the Experience with Billy and Mitch did it. So I think it was definitely going to be a keeper for him.
So, Ed, in the studio, what was, did Jimmy have a go-to sort of setup, like an amp, a guitar, or did he experiment? We always think of him with the Strat and the Marshall, but it was never clear to me whether he tried different amps or whether he would, in the studio, use a Les Paul or a Flying V or whatever it is.
Yeah, I just wanted to say for the record, Jimi Hendrix used a Les Paul and a small Fender amp for all of the albums. No, just kidding. I thought I would get a little shock out of it. The Marshall amp is the one. I can remember, for instance, that the record player really got some.
There's some snorts out there.
Yeah. I do remember very clearly in the beginning, certainly in '68 at the record plant, when we were cutting Electric Ladyland, Voodoo Child, big Showman stack, biggest Showman stack I'd ever seen. I mean, you can hear that amp, it's so clear on Voodoo Child. It's just, when it roars and opens up, it's got a particular woofy kind of sound that is so identifiable. But most of the time it'd be a single stack slam bottom Marshall with either a 100-watt top. I don't know if there was any 50 watts, so it would more than likely be hundreds. It's road stuff, but I think what would happen is the roadie, Jerry the band, would bring in a couple of amps, and he would just go between the two to see which one sounded better. When we sometimes at Electric Lady later on during the 1970 period, we would use quite often two Marshall heads, two Marshall slant bottoms, take a Y chord out of the guitar and go through two pedals, whatever he was working on at that time, whether it was some kind of crazy thing with some weird sound that would make the sound twirl around, but we do it in stereo. And that was really cool, is to hear that thing going off in the studio. Woo! That's quite the same. But without question, Marshall, and then people always ask me, how loud did he play? Well, the amp would be turned up to the point where it was, you could really shake the whole room. But Jimmy was so good at just using the volume control on the guitar, just to turn it down for the dynamics. That was part of his genius.
On this record, John, as you mentioned, what's really cool is there's like little guest appearances in addition to his different rhythm sections. But he does a couple of things with Stephen Stills. And one is a really early version of Woodstock. It was, long before Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young put it out. And Jimmy is playing bass on it, and he is totally kicking ass. I mean, he might be the best bass player of his time.
It was amazing. I mean, the story about that session is so cool because part of this album, as we were just talking about, is Jimmy jamming with his friends, and Jimmy used to jam a lot. And Stephen Stills, an old friend, he jammed with him in London, recorded with him there, certainly in New York at the record plant. So one night, Jimmy's actually in the record plant doing his thing, and Stills comes bursting into the control room. Hey man, I got this song, it's called Woodstock, man, it's really cool, and Joni Mitchell wrote it, blah, blah, blah. You gotta hear it. So he plays it for Jimmy, and yeah, okay, let's go in and jam it. So Buddy Miles on drums, Jimmy picks up a bass, plugs in, but he's playing what is necessary for the song. He's not playing like Jimi Hendrix, a superstar guitar player. He's Mr. Session Guy. And that was part of his paying tribute not only to the song that was being presented, but he's playing that role, a session guy. I love it.
Well, he's playing like a session guy, but he's really kicking the song in the ass, I have to tell you. It's pretty spectacular.
I mean, he set the bar high. I mean, certainly on Electric Ladyland, a lot of that is Jimmy on bass. So, and you can hear it. I mean, when you listen to some of those songs and you realize how nimble that playing is. And that's no discredit to Noel. I mean, we've heard every tape in the Hendrix library, and Mitch and Noel deserve tremendous credit. I mean, these guys, this wasn't a band that met in high school and played bars and bonded. They were hired to serve as his backing band, and what lucky choices they made. Mitch was a brilliant drummer, and Noel, right up until Noel's, listen to those live recordings from 1969. He is driving Jimmy, pushing him. It's a dynamic that's built on tension, much different than with Billy Cox. But those two served him very, very well.
I mean, Jimmy at that time obviously is one of the great musicians, and probably could have played with a lot of different people. Do you know why did he dig Stephen so much, playing with Stephen? Because they did quite a few things in the studio, and Jimmy played.
Well, Eddie can speak to the Scene Club and the lure of the Scene Club, but I think anybody that was around there, Jimmy would pull out. And Stephen certainly was a name, but I mean, he would, Graham Bond. I mean, whoever is in town. If you think of the classic Voodoo Child session,
was on that.
Jack Cassidy and Steve Winwood. Hey man, come on back. You can't get better than that.
But the cool thing was, so Jimmy's at the scene. Okay, here we are. We're in New York City, 321 West 44th Street. That's where the record plant was. 2 blocks up on 8th Avenue on 46 was the Scene Club, which was like downstairs in the basement. And Jimmy would be in the scene pretty much every night, because we're supposed to start at 8 o'clock. Of course, we're looking at it's midnight before he would come in, and so at this particular night where they have a lot of people in the club and Jimmy's jamming and he's Jack Cassidy, cool, they're jamming together, and Steve Winwood on organ. This is the time when all the British guys are coming over and stealing our thunder, right? No, they weren't. They were adding to it. But the fact
spoken like a true Brit.
But Steve Winwood and Hendrix really were kindred souls. Jimmy actually, I think there was a point where he wanted to bring Winwood into a band that he was thinking of doing. That's pretty well known. But imagine, okay, so they finish jamming at the Scene. They come out of the club. Jimmy says, "Come on, let's go back to the record plant." Imagine Jimi Hendrix you know, with the hat, the feather, the guitar case, and they're walking down 8th Avenue, right, dragging like 20 people behind, stopping traffic. Come on, that's New York, you know, and they walk into the record plant. We're ready. I mean, we are ready. We've got, everything has been tested, the amps, the mics, everything, and Jimmy walks in with the guys. They start playing. One rehearsal, one take, bam, live, done, thank you very much, good night.
I also think, too, Brad, what's interesting is that Jimmy was a very loyal guy, you know, and remembered those who were good to him. And I think Stephen, in the aftermath of Monterey, you know, was somebody that, you know, was inviting and open and excited about Jimmy, like recognized how great he was. So I think, you know, I remember Mitch Mitchell telling us a story, he just was, you know, he's great, and, you know, we were together with Brad Whitford from Aerosmith and a few other musicians on the Experience Hendrix tour, and they finally had Mitch, and they were like, okay, we're going to open up the door and get all the goods. It's like, all right, Mitch, Monterey pop, and women, and this, and drugs, everything. And Mitch looked at him and said, I'll have you know, we were lucky to get a pinnet of strawberries. He says, nobody cared about us or nice to us other than Mama Cass and John Phillips. Afterwards, things changed. But he goes, so they always remember that. Like, Mitch always, like, you know, John Phillips was so good and kind to us. And I just think they came, you know, everything was on the line, and they remembered those people who were good to them.
And Johnny Winter, it's a nice little cameo on the album as well.
Well,
and how did Jimmy regard Johnny?
It's the same story.
Scene Club.
Yeah, the
Is that
Scene
the same?
Club.
In fact, Eddie did that first record. So, I mean, it was kind of all in the family there. And
Steve Paul, who owned the scene, the Steve Paul scene on 46th Street. There's Johnny Winter jamming in the club, and then Jimmy comes up, wow, I got to jam with this guy. They're jamming away. What a perfect opportunity. Let's go to the session, man. And it's respect. It was his respect.
So you're sleeping in bed.
No, I'm not even sleeping, dude. I'm sitting at the bloody record plant waiting for it.
waiting.
And then they're calling and calls to you to come in and do the session.
You know,
Well, I mean, I remember a funny story that he told me about the scene, and that he and Jimmy were there, excited to see NRBQ.
Oh, yeah.
So I think it was a place where you could see cool bands at that time that were kind of on the rise.
But I mean, you weren't at the studio 24/7, so they had to.
oh yeah?
Yeah. In those days, I guess we could do those sorts of
Yes,
things.
when we were younger. I'm still in the bloody studio every bloody day.
So one of my favorite, I mean, there's a lot of great music on this, on both sides of the sky. But one track that really stood out to me and made me sort of grateful that this series was happening, that you guys were doing this and bringing this music to light, was a song called Send My Love to Linda. And I'm listening to it, you know, and it starts out like almost like a little bit of nothing, you know. It sounds like a bit of a demo. Jimmy's playing, you know, some cool rhythm guitar and sort of singing. And then all of a sudden, like 2 minutes in, he pulls out the most ridiculous guitar solo I've ever heard. It just, you know, rips your head off, okay?
I've got to tell you a little inside story to that. You know, what we did with that particular track is we presented it as a composite. It's 3 different pieces that we put together to show that it was a song in development. But what's so great about it, it just speaks to exactly what Eddie just said. On that night, Eddie and Jimmy were at a different studio, Juggy Sound, mixing the Band of Gypsies album. So after a number of hours doing that, Jimmy's like, hey, Billy and Buddy are over at the record plant, man, come on over. So they go over, and, you know, now there's, you know, 2-3 more reels of tape that are created because Jimmy's excited, obviously, you know, wants to play, and so, you know, Eddie dialed that up, and it sounds amazing. So we felt like, yeah, we got to put it in, coupled with the fact that if you listen to the Woodstock recording, that descending bass line that Jimmy plays, again, typical Jimmy, always had these patterns in his head. He uses that in Send My Love to Linda because he knew this is fertile ground. I want to keep this in my mind. And then in that song, it fit, and that's what he did.
As you guys mentioned earlier, there's always been a bit of controversy and sort of speculation about what was going on with Jimmy in sort of the last 6 months of his life, you know, like, you know, among us people that don't know, we're like, oh, you know, he was, no, man, he was playing some of the best guitar ever. No, he was, you know, confused about his direction. Like, there's a lot of just speculation about that period of time. Did you feel like he knew, I mean, did you feel that sense, was there that sense of confusion, or do you think that Jimmy had some sense of where he was headed?
Where I think the confusion may have come from was his mental state in regards to the business affairs. That was really eating at him. And I know when he went to England, when he said goodbye in August, I know to go on the final tour, he had some business that he had to take care of. He was convinced that he had to get rid of Michael Jeffries. That was primarily on his agenda. And he wanted to reach out to Chaz, which he did. To put
Chaz Chandler,
Chaz
being
Chandler,
his
sorry, folks.
original
Producer.
yeah.
And I think he needed some sort of going back to basics, you know, Chaz, myself, put that back together. And in fact, he called me a week before he died. I was sitting at the Electric Lady, and somebody said, hey, Jimmy's calling from London. And I pick up the phone, and he said, hey man, Jimmy, can you bring some of those, can you bring the tapes over to London? I said, Jimmy, we just spent $1 million building the studio. Can you wait? I said, yeah. He said, no problem, don't worry about it, it's cool. I'll see you in a week or so. So I didn't get the feeling that he was stressed about the business thing, about the musical side of things. I thought things were going along really well in the sense that he had already established in '69, going into '70, this is the new direction. It's taking some of the funk and R&B of the band of Gypsies, starting the new Jimi Hendrix experience, and now Mitch is back in the band, the new Jimi Hendrix experience. And by the way, Mitch, hearing Mitch's playing has really shifted. I mean, he's got a funky beat now. I mean, and he's scaled back some of the flamboyant fills and stuff. So this is the new direction of the music. I strongly felt that. But as far as the rest of it, no, I think it was the business side that was haunting him.
Right, because I felt like, again, when you listen to the later studio tracks, things like Freedom or Nightbird Flying, I mean, you're hearing a new Jimi Hendrix there.
And, without question, no doubt.
And it's a much more structured, again, sort of funky, angular, the sort of orchestral sort of approach. String quartet, on the guitar or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's the great tragedy of obviously losing him at that time. Had he finished that next record, I think his legacy would be, really different in a lot of ways, because it would have been the completion of that step. As much as Electric Ladyland was different from Axis Bold as Love, certainly for somebody who enjoyed Electric Ladyland, even to hear Band of Gypsies, you can't imagine to hear like Machine Gun, like where on earth did that come from? And then I think, what's interesting, Brad, in some ways about Jimmy is that he was always ahead of his audience. Underground FM radio was starting, and initially Top 40 didn't embrace Jimi Hendrix. So, as that started to happen, he started to really build an audience. And then by the time the Monterey Pop movie comes out, that's a year ago in his world. And then by the time the Woodstock movie comes, which is an enormous worldwide hit, him playing the Star Spangled Banner, he's been playing that for over a year. So I think that lent, Jimmy didn't do a lot of interviews. He was hardly a record company's dream. When he went on the Dick Cavett show, he played 2 songs that weren't even on a record. When he went on the Tonight Show as one appearance, he played a song that wasn't even on a record. He was never about plugging celebrities, selling himself, wanting to do that. I think it was always forward. And that's part of why I think there's still that mystery that's attached to him. It's created, I think, for everybody, a personal connection to him, because it's a story that never resolved itself. So it's how you connect to the music, and I think that's what drives the inspiration with all of his fans.
Well said. Now I want you to just give me the first thing that comes off the top of your head, Eddie. Was there
spaghetti?
Bring this man some food. So, is there something like, of course, you'd been involved in great sessions with all sorts of musicians through the years, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, seen it all. But do you remember like just maybe one instance where you heard something that Jimmy played and you just went, holy shit, did I just hear that? What was, can you, I know that there are many of those moments, but.
That's just the thing, there were just so many. And funny, we were talking tonight about a situation where, by the way, I always, 99.9% of the time I had a quarter-inch machine running at 7.5 just to have it running through the whole session. At this one particular moment at Electric Lady, the machine was not running, and Jimmy was in the studio just by himself, and he just ripped off this freaking awesome thing, and I said, damn, that's good. And I hit the record button, and I said, Jimmy, would you mind playing that again?
This is something I love because I brought it to Eddie and he just cracked up. We put it on the West Coast Seattle Boy Box set. It's a thing called Play That Riff. And Jimmy plays this ungodly riff. And Eddie's like, do that again. I don't want you to forget that. And so Jimmy's like, rips it off again. And Eddie's like, thank you. Like, we'll save that for later.
What else can you say?
Like,
just
my
thank
Lord.
you, because how do you keep up with that guy? I mean, just being in the studio with him, all of your faculties have to be available. And I was not the guy who was being stoned. I mean, the rest of the world could be stoned, but there had to be one straight guy. Yeah, I know, it sounds funny, but it's true. I can tell you many stories about when I was not that. I was horizontal rather than vertical, but that's another story for another day.
But there was so much incredible music happening in that era. And I know from our perspective, it's easy to sort of look back and say, wow, that was really, something incredible. And we have this perspective. But I was sort of wondering if during the time you understood that what you were creating was something that was going to be timeless.
No time to be timeless in my head. It was all I could do to stay ahead of the game and get stuff on tape and get him sounds that he wanted. And we were talking about it earlier. We were working ridiculous hours. I mean, we were lucky to get what we got, I think, in many ways, because if you go back to the first album, to Are You Experienced, that was primitive 4-track, can you imagine? And the next album was using 2 4-track machines going 4 to 4, and then after that, when I came to the States, it's now 8 or 12 or then 16. So your mind is just sort of preoccupied with, how do I get this on tape? How do I make it sound really great? How do I interpret what Jimmy's saying to get those sounds? So to think about, is this going to stand up for the rest of time? No. After the fact, yes. After he died, and the world sort of changed, I think, after that.
I've got to also say, as a fan, Eddie and I have been working together for so long, and for which I'm obviously very grateful, but there are times when I'll say, yeah, but Eddie, what about, he goes, John, as great as that was, tomorrow was going to be great too. It was Jimi Hendrix. Like every time we were in the studio, something good was going to come out of it. And I'm like, look, listen. He's just like, oh man, it was great. It'll be great again. I think they were young and never thought that obviously what happened would happen.
Just have 1 or 2 more before we turn it over to the audience to ask a couple questions, so be thinking. Do you think that is this going to be the last of the studio releases?
Well, there's two things to say. Look, this isn't the last album, the last chord, the last shoe, the last any of that nonsense. It's our job with what we're trying to do, Janie, Eddie, and I, is share Jimmy's music in a way where people can appreciate it, understand it, and again, you'll make your personal connection to it, you'll fit it into your own playlist, you'll do all the things you want to do because of your direct connection with Jimmy. It's like I often say, if somebody were to find a wire recording of Robert Johnson, we'd all want to hear it. So if something were to emerge that was really spectacular, we'd want to share it. But in terms of an album, we felt these 3 records were the best of the remaining more finished studio examples that we could share in this kind of a way. There's some great live things. There are some other kind of thematic releases that we're looking at, film footage of concerts, things of that nature. But, if something were to come over the transom that was amazing, Eddie's the first call to say, Ed, let's get in the studio, man. You got to hear this. So, it's certainly possible. It seems, as much as you want to say we're 50 years on and it's less likely, I mean, we've had people recently come up to us with, recordings that you were like, you're kidding me, where were you, 10 years ago, so.
The other thing, I know you guys must have at least discussed this, but would you ever consider, okay, all the original recordings, all the original mixes have been cleaned up and digitized, and we have those, and we're grateful for that. Would you ever consider using modern technology and everything, completely remixing the records? I mean, I've seen, Steve Wilson, I thought, has done really great work with the King Crimson catalog.
But those guys are alive, and I think that's the thing. We're here, and even the role of experienced Hendrix is, Jimmy left so few things where he was able to put his thumbprint on it. So we're very fortunate that Eddie's been involved since day one, because you have that context of what they were trying to do at that time. And, as Eddie has often said, a lot of the great songs we all know and love were four-handed mixes where he and Jimmy had this unique relationship in terms of mixing where Jimmy's trying to go for one thing, Eddie's going for another thing. So I understand why other artists do it, but even in the case recently of Sgt. Pepper, you still have Paul and Ringo to be able to say, wait a minute, why I'm not happy with that or change that. So it's hard, I think, to take Jimmy out of the equation. Nothing articulates Hendrix better than Hendrix. He does all the heavy lifting. With all these releases, it's because of Jimmy. That's why everybody here is excited. It's why, the albums have been as successful as they are. I think the danger is that when you start to put your own creative stamp in it in a way, it's hard. For an artist as unique as Hendrix, it's hard to get up on that level and really feel like you captured a vision that he would have been happy with.
It would be very difficult for me to even consider thinking about Electric Ladyland as an album to remix. Wow. I'd have to get back to that state of mind in '68. And the pall of green smoke that sort of sat right about above my head. Jeez, give me a break. I'm sure put it out to the floor.
You guys, yes, we're going to put it out to the floor.
There's so many hands up.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much.
Domo arigato.
This is a real pleasure and really enlightening. I had two questions. Both of them are futuristic. In terms of the metaphorical pipe that you spoke about, Eddie, how far down the road does that pipe go?
Whoa, that's really metaphorical.
Well, you mentioned
the New Jersey Turnpike, or what are we talking here?
You had songs that you were going to save for later down the pike.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I see where you're coming from.
I think by this record we're there. I think we also have a bootleg label that we started, records that aren't sold in stores that are kind of by fans, for fans, which allow us to show more formative things that he was doing. But I don't know. I think we're trying to keep the bar as high as we can, and I think from a fan's perspective, you want to be able to feel like this record stands up to People, Hell and Angels, to Valleys of Neptune, to Southside and Delta, to a lot of the other things that we release.
I've got a comment. That's a very English Cockney way of saying it. We've got a few odds and sods that are left in the box, and Tony, if you're here, piss off. Where's Tony? Tony, my mate. One of the biggest Hendrix fans in the room.
But you guys are in it is a difficult position because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Listen, we got the greatest job in the world. It ain't difficult. Trust me, man. Jimmy has done all the heavy lifting for us. He really has. The music speaks for itself. There's no pressure from Sony Music, the Hendrix family. It's really been about a plan, like trying to present these packages in a way that fans can come away and say, wow, so that was between Axis and Electric Ladyland. Oh, that's great. I think you can always be hopeful that something would come up that you'd be like, oh man, this is amazing. But,
Who's next?
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, man.
Thanks for doing this, guys. Eddie, when did you first meet Jimmy? And did you know anything about him before that? And did you have expectations? And after meeting him, did that change? What did you think then?
Well, there's a lot of questions, but all right. Very first question: when did I meet him? January of '69. January of '67 at Olympic Studios in London. You want to hear a funny story about how that occurred? Anybody? Oh, okay. All right, so I have to stand up there because I can't bloody chill all night. I have to move around. We had heard about Jimmy, who hadn't in London. You know, he had taken over the scene. He'd come over to England in mid-'66 with Chaz. Within a couple of months, he's opening at the Paris Olympia. He does a hit single, Hey Joe, boom, 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 and here we are at the end of that year, January '67. Chaz had heard about the new Olympic, new studio. They come in, they book some time, and the first thing, before I even knew they were coming in, I get a phone call from the studio manager. Now, the studio manager was this lovely lady named Anna Menzies, and she was very prim, very proper, lovely English lady, but she ran the studio with an iron fist, and she didn't want to let anybody near her, because all the lads in the studio, of course, were eyeing her up, but of course we couldn't because we were very young city boys. Anyway, she calls me up on the phone. She says, "Hello, Eddie, this is Anna, and there's this American chappie with the big hair, and you do all that weird shit anyway, so why don't you do him?" And that's exactly how I got to record Mr. Hendrix. True story. Oh, and the rest of it was, I can't remember the rest of your question, but it was, was it up to expectations? We had heard the record, you know, the singles, we knew about him, he was in the press. Just as I said earlier, just standing there in the studio, listening to those amps, it just blew my mind. What else can I say?
I enjoyed hearing that story about how Jimmy heard Joni Mitchell's Woodstock for the first time and just went in the studio and did it. I figured there would have been more prep work. But to add to that, Jimmy would have been playing a right-handed bass upside down backwards, right?
Correct. Yep. I'll tell you an interesting story to add to that, is that when Johnny Winter came up, I think in December of '68, January '69, Tommy Shannon, who later was the bass player for Stevie Ray Vaughan, it was such a point of pride to Tommy Shannon that Jimi Hendrix borrowed his bass so he could jam with him. And he said, and you know, he flipped it over and killed on it. He says he just killed it. And so Tommy, that has always been something Tommy's really proud of, that he, you know, while he didn't get to jam, he was able to give his bass to Jimmy so Jimmy could jam.
Yeah, I mean, listen to All Along the Watchtower. It's classic. You know.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello?
Quick question. Knowing what you know about Mr. Hendrix, is there a particular artist that came on the scene after he passed that you think he would have really wanted to work with? Who would that be? Like, who would have turned on the most? I work with that guy.
Well, think about the fact that Electric Lady Studios, the next really big client that came in, Stevie Wonder. So if Stevie Wonder is in B and Jimmy's in A, or, you know what I mean? Like, can't imagine they're going to meet in the hall and, you know, and can't imagine what could have come out of that. I also feel that I think the blues legends that Jimmy loved would have maybe been less kind of skeptical about him and would have embraced him. And I think at some point it would have been a real point of pride for him to do something with Muddy Waters or Howlin' Wolf. I think, you know, they were huge, you know, influences for Jimmy. And I think that, you know, Hubert Sumlin told a great story about how Jimmy sat in with them when they were in London, and the guys in the band were like, "Who's this guy?" You know, but Hubert said, "I saw that guy and I thought, I'm going to get fired. Wolf's going to hire that guy." You know, so I think that would have meant a lot to him if he'd had the chance to play with Muddy Waters.
I was delayed coming in, so if you covered this, sorry. But with the, you know, just the mere notion of studios now being, I mean, you can hardly get arrested now if you say I have a studio. It's all self-done. But I always found Electric Lady highly intriguing back when it was the shoe alley. 8th Street was all shoe stores. Now there's 0, I think. It was a whole different world. So I'm just wondering, though, Eddie, Michael Shearer, you know me, but you if you covered this, sorry, but I know you had a pretty big role in designing the vibe and the sound and the setup of the studio, right, with Jimmy, and I mean, you're an architect of it, and I'm just wondering, did you cover this already? Because I'm wondering.
No, we didn't, but it's an interesting, I know where you're going with it. You want to know what hand did I have in actually, okay, the story goes very briefly. Jimmy buys the Generation nightclub with his manager, Michael Jeffries, because he loved to jam there. I think they owned it for about 6 months. They're doing nothing with it, and then I think there was a photograph of a very avant-garde event space in New York City on the front cover of Life magazine, and Jimmy and Michael looked at it and said, hey, let's go to this club, and they went to this club. Very impressed by it, and they said, well, who's the architect? And they looked in the Life magazine, it was this guy, John Sturrock. They called him up, design us a nightclub, which is what he had done. And then I think at some point down the road, they said, gee, I think Jimmy wants a little 8-track studio way in the corner, a little tiny little thing. So they called me up and said, hey, would you mind coming down and looking at the space? I walk into what was the Generation, and I said to the guys, are you out of your effing minds? Jimmy is spending almost $300,000 a year in recording studios. Why don't we just make this the best recording studio in the world for Jimmy? And they said, yeah, good idea. We like that idea. So that was, the club was scrapped, and John Sturrock went out of his mind because he had designed all this beautiful nightclub. So he had to learn immediately how to become a studio architect. He actually did the architecture. I did the rest of it, the layout of where the consoles and the speakers and the choice of microphones and making sure that the thing looked and sounded correct. But it was John Sturrock who actually did the design.
Was it everything you had hoped for?
And beyond, it's still there, it's still working.
So that's a fabulous story. I mean, you're the only one that figured that out.
Well, I don't know if that was the only one, but I certainly figured out that he needed a studio rather than a nightclub.
Jimmy, thank
Well,
God to you.
Thank you everybody for your questions, and I hope that this evening was worth weathering the inclement weather. We do have copies of the CD and the album for sale, and Eddie has been kind enough to agree to sign some of them. Thank you once again for coming, and thank you, John McDermott and Eddie Kramer for.
Well, we do also have to acknowledge that our thanks to Brad, because Brad's been in our corner. Eddie and I wrote a book many years ago called Hendrix Setting the Record Straight, and Brad was the first guy who really got behind it in a big way and developed a relationship with Guitar World, and we enjoy to this day. So thank you, Brad.
Thank you very much.